And so we're honored tonight to have 4 Connecticut Freedom Workers share their varied experiences as activists during the civil rights movement of the 1960s. Mardon Walker, Willie Mann, Mary Larson, and Peter Kellman will converse tonight with Karen Lai Miller. She is our research historian at the CHS, and they will each highlight their participation in the movement for us. And these 4 activists, along with others, have shared their stories, artifacts, and images in our exhibition, Connecticut Freedom Workers Remembering the Civil Rights Movement, which is currently on display at the Connecticut Historical Society until October 16th. So with that, I'm going to stop my share and turn it over to Karen.
Hello, good evening. So I am delighted to start our conversations tonight with Willie Mann.
Hi, everyone.
So Willie Mann is a lifelong Hartford resident. He was a student in the 1960s in Hartford, and he remembers events and civil rights activities in that era, such as Dr. King coming to speak in Connecticut. So Willie, may I ask for an overview of your memories? We've talked together about how the barbershop was a gathering place in the community for people in Hartford, and you worked in your father's barbershop. And would you please share, things that you heard and learned from being in that shop?
Sure. The work I did at my dad's barbershop was mostly cleaning and sweeping the hair off the floor of the barbershop. I had a shoe shine stand, which was located in the rear of Mann's barbershop. While sitting on my shoe shine stand, I had a clear view of everything up front. While sitting in the chair, I would walk up to the front and greet everyone with a smile and ask waiting customers for a shine. A shoe shine would cost at that time 25 cents. And I took my time to do a good job. Doing a good job meant getting an extra tip, like an extra quarter. I mostly worked on Saturdays from 8 a.m. to 7 p.m. I eventually paid for my shoe shine permit, which cost 50 cents, and I received my license to ply my trade as a young entrepreneur. My dad taught me a lot about money management. You have to save some and buy your shoe shining supplies. Once you get into that habit, you feel like a businessman, just like my dad. My dad and I opened up a passbook savings account and deposited $38 in 1966. Now, the conversations and discussions coming from the customers regarding civil rights were interesting to listen to. Some folks were struggling to find work. Some folks talked about the struggles of family members living in the southern states, such as Georgia, Alabama, Florida, North Carolina, and South Carolina. I had an opportunity to listen to these experiences and how difficult it was to live in the southern states. They would collectively say that things were much better here in Connecticut. They were part of the Great Migration to the north. I learned so much about working on farms through listening to their experiences. Then manufacturing became a popular employment opportunity for most Blacks during the Great Migration. I've met with armed service veterans who had their stories of war too, such as World War II, the Korean War, and the Vietnam War as well. My dad would visit the Veterans Hospital in Newington to give them haircuts, white or black. In March of 1966, I had an opportunity to meet Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. at an evening church rally in the North End. My father, my brother Lennon, and I were quite excited, but we were rambunctious when we were together, slap fighting each other, which was a way to learn how to fight and defend yourself. I did not know who Dr. King was at the time, but I heard him speak about the challenges of fair housing, jobs, and to actively seek civil rights, voters registration. I would ask my dad, what did it mean? Dr. King gave my dad a photo whereby he put it in the barbershop as a memento. They seem to have known each other since, of course, they did come from Georgia. In meeting some of the civil rights leaders, such as Boyce Barlow, my dad's personal attorney, and a great leader in the city, Reverend Richard Battles, Reverend Evans, Reverend Oates, and other civil rights leaders in the city. When President Lyndon Baines Johnson appointed Thurgood Marshall to the Supreme Court, that's when you can hear a great buzz of excitement in 1967. The children of our neighborhood were good neighbors. We got along with everyone for the most part. There were very few fights. Our school, Miriam Hooker Elementary, was very diverse with white, black, and Puerto Rican families. We were residents of a public housing project named Charter Oak Terrace. If anything, our neighborhood was blessed with youth organizations such as the Boys and Girls Clubs, the Salvation Army Youth Organizations, and the Charter Oak Terrace Community Center. Most of us, as far as listening to the music of our time, music was our outlet. We looked forward to listening to the radio stations to hear some of the greatest Motown hits, such as Sam Cooke's hit, A Change is Going to Come, and as well as The Temptations, Ball of Confusion. That's what the world is today. At that time, hey, hey, still to this day. Just My Imagination was a wonderful love song, My Girl, and Too Proud to Beg. And the Four Tops had Bernadette, and then Louis Armstrong with It's a Wonderful World. Now, as far as the Black churches, we were always there meeting and worshiping the good Lord above. And then, of course, we were there to organize, to strategize, and to participate in planned marches, such as the marches in 1967. I did not participate in any of the marches because of my young age, but I did participate in the Puerto Rican parades in New Haven, sponsored by the Sacred Heart Church in Hartford. This was an annual event for a Boy Scout Troop 294 and the Memorial Day Parade in Elmwood, Connecticut in 1969. As a child and with our peers, we were challenged to do our best in school. I was an eager learner. I loved going to school. We had teachable moments when it came to understanding the struggles of civil rights. We were
And
advised to
oh,
arm ourselves
thank
with
you
getting.
so Willie, I'm sorry to interject, but can you tell us? I'm sure I really want to hear about what happened afterwards. Like, what did you go on? The civil rights movement had a great impact in shaping your life, and
Yeah,
can you talk a little bit about what you went on to do in your adult life?
sure. I had completed high school education at the Morgan Gardner Buckley High School in 1975. I was then accepted and matriculated at the UConn and graduated in 1979. I majored in business administration, finance, and then minored in education. And then from there, I was also worked in corporate America after I did graduate from uh, college at UConn. And then, of course, went through some uh, 15 years of corporate America. At that point in time, I was looking for a career change. And then, of course, I got into education. So I came back to Harvard. And then, of course, I was a teacher, worked on the support staff of the Harvard Board of Education. And as well as my last position was a paraprofessional at the same high school that I graduated from. Now I am semi-retired with 3 or 4 seasonal part-time positions at a sporting and concert events, the Hartford Yard Goats, the XL Center, and the City of Hartford Parks and Recreation. And then, of course, I volunteer at a number of other things as well too throughout the city, which is a way of giving back to the place where I was born and raised, and enjoy the Monday Night Jazz Festival that are actually starting this year again. So that,
Thank you so, and you are a supporter of the CHS.
yes, I am.
And we're so thankful. Thank you
Thank you.
so much for sharing your memories and stories with us.
Thank you.
Thanks. And next we welcome Mary Larson. Hello, Mary.
Hello, hello everyone.
So Mary Larson was from Hartford. In 1964, she graduated from Brown University and became a freedom worker. There were various groups that organized activists in the South, and Mary was part of COFO, the Congress of Federated Organizations, and she participated in sit-ins and also worked as a freedom school coordinator. Mary, could you talk a little bit about how you became involved in the civil rights movement, please?
Sure. So I was a senior at Brown, and I was all ready to go to Tunisia with the Peace Corps. I had been accepted to do that. And then people came to Brown from Mississippi, and they stayed several days, and they held sessions for whoever wanted to come. And they were the most impressive people I've ever met. Fannie Lou Hamer was among them, James Farmer and others. And I remember vividly the first time they held a session, they said racism was not the problem of a few people who were racist. They said racism is structural. It's structural in the whole nation. It's a deep-seated structural problem. And I had been raised to think that America was such a good country. And if something wasn't going right, it was just a little problem. It was just a little glitch. And I shook my head and said, no way, can't be true. But by 2 days from then, I was converted, and I did believe that racism was far more than I had thought that it was. My best friend, whose name was Ruth Sheriff, and I decided that we would participate. They had made the decision to recruit white students because people in Mississippi were being killed, Black people, and no attention was being paid to that. And they thought by recruiting white folks, not only could they get workers to help in the projects they were doing, but if someone was hurt or killed, a spotlight would be shown on what was happening in Mississippi. You're muted.
I know. It's bound to happen.
I know. I know.
I was reading newspaper articles about your work, and you focused on making sure that you were supporting local African Americans and their activism. I have a quote here from, I'm going to take you way back, Mary, to February 26, 1965. You said, "A civil rights worker is an organizer, he doesn't lead, who tries to bring people together to talk and work on common problems." So I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit about, this approach of not telling people what to do, but rather supporting them.
Sure. I can give you negative and positive examples of that. The negative example was on my first project in Moss Point, Mississippi. And they had a very active local group happening. And the project was overrun with white male college students. and it wrecked the project because they took over. They didn't know they were taking over. They had no awareness of what they were doing. But people disappeared from the project, good leaders and teenagers just disappeared. And so that was a negative example. But another example, I would say, where things work the way they should work was in Clay County in Northeast Mississippi. I was Freedom School coordinator there. And after starting up some, I think 5 projects in different parts of this large rural county, I went to the furthest rural reaches of the county in a little town called Phoebe. And I got to Phoebe in a little shack that the COFOs, they called us the COFOs, were going to stay in. And all these kids met me, these great kids. And they said, well, you know, it's about time. You know, I mean, we've really been waiting. We're ready to start a school boycott. And I said, what? And are you sure? And have you thought it through? And could you get hurt? So I was actually holding back. But luckily they didn't listen to me and they went ahead. They were bused to school in the summer because there was field work in the spring and in the fall. So they took their buses to school, left the buses and walked down the street to a Baptist church. And they started a freedom school. And that's how it worked every day. Then when the day was over, they'd go back to the buses and take them home again. So that went on. Now, this was the happening thing in the county. And we had, at that point, 1965, a really large staff. And everyone converged because this was what was happening. It was the biggest thing in the county. And immediately, all the COFOs were arrested. I remember I didn't want to be arrested. And I was kind of squinching down on the bottom of a car. And there was a knock on the window. And it was the game warden. And it was the gig is up. So I was hauled along with everyone else, hauled off to jail. And it was the best thing that ever happened to the project. The kids got the car keys, the teenagers got the car keys, and they got no interference because we were all gone. And they were wonderful. They ran their school, they put out a newsletter, they organized parents, and everything went along okay. In a few days, we were out of jail and I was back trying to help out the best I could. I could go on and on about this. It goes on and on. The authorities made a mistake one day. Well, first of all, they tried to keep the kids out of the buses. It was so funny. The kids would round up the buses and the Black bus drivers were not too, willing to not take the kids. I mean, they did what they had to do, but the kids would round up the buses, capture the buses and get themselves home. That was the first pushback from the authorities. The next pushback was arrests. They arrested 60 children and carted them off to town, to the county seat, fingerprinted them, which made the parents very angry. And eventually, of course, the parents got them and they were let go and nobody was hurt. But it changed the whole project. The project changed from being 21 demands for school change, and not one of the demands was integration. They thought if they tried to integrate, someone would be killed. So they had 21 demands regarding books, lab equipment, rehiring good teachers that had been fired, and a bunch of stuff like that. And they got some of those demands. But the parents' concern was about allotments, crop allotments, which were controlled, of course, by the whites, and the Blacks got very little of allotments for growing. I think it was tobacco, mostly. But so they took that up as an issue and carried on, fighting that issue. So so the best thing, as far as my role on that was, the best thing that happened was that people did what they knew how to do best, and I watched and admired and did what I could to be supportive.
I think you're being really modest, Mary. And then may I ask, how the civil rights movement, your activism impacted and shaped the rest of your life? It's a huge question for a short
Yeah,
amount of time.
it did really. Of course, the first thing was even happened at the recruitment when I changed from thinking of the United States, the wonderful, exceptional light of the world, to the United States far from that. It almost went from glass all the way full to glass all the way empty. So I really became rather anti our government for quite a while. When I was in Mississippi, especially in '65, people were gearing up to protest the Vietnam War. And I remember thinking, well, I don't know what's going on. I don't understand this. So I had to start reading, and I read and came to the same conclusion that that war was wrong. And being young, I mean, it felt so wrong. It felt like I couldn't stand it. The same thing, though, happened in another way. In 1965 and '64, there were a lot of people who were talking Marxism and were well versed in that. And I thought, well, that's something I have to do because I don't understand that and I don't know what it is. And I wasn't able to do that after I got back to the North, to New York, where I lived for many years. I didn't find a way to study Marxism, but it's something I'm doing right now with a group called the Marxist Education Project. And it's thrilling to be learning at my age. I think another thing is that I avoided any corporate jobs. I was at loose ends for a while. I was temping for a while, living in New York, this and that. And I had the opportunity to take corporate jobs and I didn't. And I think because of that reason, my experience there, I ended up partnering with a left-wing activist who lived in Newark. And I moved into Newark with him. And that was in 1978. And we were a community organization, the Orchard Street Association, and worked for years, especially with the children. We had a children's traveling circus for a while. It wasn't that bad. It was either really bad or not bad at all. And to be in the circus, you had to live on the block and your mother had to let you. And so we had quite a wild crew. And we had a circus bus and we traveled to Vermont every year. And we performed in New York sometimes, and the kids all got paid. Everyone got paid $5 no matter what they did. So yeah, I guess, I mean, I guess that's it. Was a big supporter of the Occupy movement, which happened in Newark as well as in New York, happened somewhat differently. I still live in the house I lived in all those years working with the kids on the block. I have a community garden that I work on, but life is smaller than it used to be for me.
I'm going to leave everyone with some information about Mary that she's probably too modest to share. Mary, when you were in jail in February of 1965, you chose to remain in jail so that your friend Nancy Sowers did not remain alone in prison. And you did that again in March. You didn't leave the prison, even though you were able to post bail, and you decided to stay to make sure that everyone else was safe and leaving altogether. So I just wanted to share with our audience a little insight on the heart of Mary Larson. Thank you, Mary. And we get to speak to Peter Kellman next. Hello, Pete.
Good evening.
Hi. So Pete was a member of the New England Committee for Nonviolent Action, which was based in Voluntown. When he was 19 years old, he was sent to work on the Selma to Montgomery March, which occurred on March 7th through the 21st of 1964. Pete, would you tell us about your work and what you did for the Selma to Montgomery March, please?
I'm sure. The committee asked me to go down to represent them on the march, and they gave me bus fare from Connecticut, and I headed south by myself, and I arrived in Selma. I had been followed all the way down through the bus drivers and the people that worked at the bus stations. But slight harassment, nothing real serious. But I got to Selma, and when I got out of the bus station, and by the way, the buses and the bus stations were still segregated in Selma when I got there. And the next year, or that winter, I was in Jackson, and that bus terminal was still segregated too. Anyways, I immediately walked out on the street and found an African American and said, "How do I get to Brown's Chapel Church?" And that was my first lesson, I think, in survival in the civil rights movement. The person told me that the way to get there was to go down certain streets where white people likely wouldn't see you. So you wouldn't get in any trouble until you got to the Black Projects and Brown's Chapel Church. And so I did that, and I got there, and they had a place to register in the back of the church, and they had food for everybody pretty much 24 hours a day. And the first couple days I was there, there was an injunction on marching, and they had what they called the Berlin Wall around the projects. And so that we couldn't have a demonstration that left the projects to go to the federal building, which was the focus of demonstrations in the county courthouse where people registered to vote, or where people wanted to register to vote. Up until that point, they weren't able to. And I was assigned a place to live in Selma on 1416 St. Philip Street with the King family. And then as we got closer to the march, well, first I participated in some of the demonstrations that were trying to leave the projects, but were stopped every time by state troopers and mainly sheriffs. And I was given the job of basically supervising the putting up and taking down of the tent sites, the campsites during the march. And so every morning we'd leave Selma pretty early, take down the tents, go to the next location for the next night. And we'd line up shoulder to shoulder. The crew that I had was 50 seminarians and a Hollywood star and myself. And we walked through the campsites shoulder to shoulder, basically checking for bombs with our bodies. And then after we did, then the Army came in, and then they did it with their Geiger counters and everything. Anyways, we would set up we set up the big tents, and then go to the next site, basically, to try to, see if we could get things ready. But just as a note, it seemed to me that on several of the mornings when we got up and were on the road, they didn't have a campsite for that evening. I mean, it was pretty tenuous. The whole march was very tenuous. And when I reflect back on the people in the march, actually, there were only 200 people that were chosen to march the whole distance. A lot of people joined the first night and the last day. But and I think of how people dress today and the kinds of things that they assume they need to have. It seemed to me that it rained almost the whole march. It was very wet. It was March in Alabama, a lot of mud. We would haul in bales of hay to put down for people to sleep on, just to cushion them from the mud. People slept on plastic so they wouldn't get wet. Some people had sleeping bags. A lot of people didn't have raincoats. They just took plastic bags and wore them. There was a medical committee for human rights. I had a lot of work because there were a lot of people with foot problems during the march. But it didn't deter anybody. It was amazing when you believe in something, what you're willing to do. And to me, I think my involvement in the civil rights movement was really my birth as an adult. And it's carried through for my whole life.
In our conversations, I've heard about how you helped register African Americans for voting, and some of the other confrontations that you faced in different moments. And so there was violence, and you faced that violence. And I was wondering, how how did that impact you, or do you have thoughts about, you're 19 years old and having a rifle pointed at you, and
It was a shotgun,
about
actually.
that? Oh, shotgun.
I don't think that was really what was important. I think what was important was the setting that all that took place in. And it, you know, keep in mind that after the march from Selma to Montgomery, the Voting Rights Act was passed. And the reason it was needed was because local registrars would not register African Americans. They refused to do it. And so part of that law created federal registrars that would come to the county courthouses once a month. And so what we would do, I mean, the work that I was involved in at that point was to go around during the week, you know, the prior month, and go door to door and try to encourage people to come to vote. I mean, what was interesting to me about that was, by then, the people who had been really active in the civil rights movement, which were not that large a percentage of the population, they registered right away. But the fear that everybody else had, and it was, or most other people hadn't been overcome yet. I mean, they could still lose their jobs, they could lose their lives, they could get kicked off the land, which was what happened when I tried to pick up somebody, a group of us tried to pick up somebody who wanted to register to vote, an old woman, and the owner of the plantation came and put a shotgun in my face and said that if she registers to vote, she'll lose the house, that she won't be able to live here anymore. And so, I mean, I think that's what was important. It isn't so much what I personally went through, because I didn't go through anything anywhere near what people who lived there went through every day, and the fear that they lived with. I could always go home. I could always go north. Most people couldn't, and they needed to have jobs. They needed to have a place to stay. And so overcoming that fear, even though they didn't have to go before a local registrar, there was a federal registrar there that would register them without any problem. Just to go overcome that fear to get there was a tremendous organizing project. I mean, I spent days going around to the same houses day after day after day, talking to people one-on-one, and meeting with them, and just trying to encourage them, and to find friends that would encourage each other and go as a group. And so we would, and a lot of people didn't have cars, and so part of what we did was to organize rides to register people to vote. So I think that people they think about the march, they think about the victory, but they really don't know much about how to overcome fear, which I think was the major job of the civil rights movement, was organizing a response to real fear that came after Reconstruction. It had been there for 100 years. You know, lynchings are real things, and that's just one thing. You know, I mean, there were so many things that people had to face, that to overcome, what we hear about is the heroes. We hear about the ones that did it first, the ones who went to jail, the ones who were beaten up, and rightly so. But what was significant to me was what everybody else was going through, and how they reacted, and how they overcame their fear. And I think Mary talked about the kids, and it was pretty interesting to me to learn that the children were not initially part of the civil rights movement. It was James Bevel, actually, that had the idea that we should be bringing kids in, and then SCLC and SNCC started to bring kids into the movement. And they were extremely powerful force. I mean, they wanted to be free, and there was no holding them back. And I remember, just as a little story, and when I was working in Sumter County, Alabama, and living in a neighborhood that had a school, and how the teachers would hate to see us come down the driveway to head to school, because they knew that there was going to be a demonstration and the kids were not going to be in school that day. So they would be quite upset when they saw us coming. But of course, the kids wanted to fight for their freedom. And so they did.
It sounds like that. I know that you also are a modest person. And it's, you know, it is people like you, all of you, and the other activists who we were fortunate to feature in our exhibit, and many others who are not named, who led the way and served as role models, especially during a time when we needed heroes. So thank you very much for sharing your stories and memories with us, Pete.
Welcome.
We are next going to talk to Mardon Walker. Hello, Marty.
Hello.
Let's see, Mardon Walker in 1964 was an exchange student at Spelman College in Atlanta. She was arrested for participating in a sit-in. Marty's case made international headlines. For her activism, she was fined $1,000, sentenced to 12 months hard labor, 6 months in prison. The judge set an astonishing bail of $15,000, and that in today's money is over $125,000. So Marty's case eventually went to the Georgia Supreme Court, where the ruling was upheld, and finally it also went to the US Supreme Court, where it was overturned. So you have had a remarkable experience, Marty, and I'd like to know if you could just tell us a little bit about, and give us an overview of your sit-in and experience and your activism.
I actually started as an exchange student from Connecticut College to Spelman College in the fall of 1963. And I was at Spelman when the church was bombed in Birmingham and the little girls were murdered. There were students in my dorm that knew them. So there was definitely talk on the Spelman campus of civil rights. But when I went there as an exchange student, I really didn't know anything about the civil rights movement. I went because it looked like an interesting thing to do in a big city, very different from my college. And that was the attitude that I took when I went to Spelman. Things changed one day when my roommate came home from shopping for our room at Woolworths, very upset because she had been refused the chance to have a soda at a lunch counter at the Woolworths. She was from Indianapolis and didn't expect to be treated like that. It gave me a new attitude about racism, because if my roommate's treatment affected her so much, then it affected me. And I started participating in some of the activities that were going on there in Atlanta, one of which was a mass march to downtown Atlanta by hundreds of college students. And we were met downtown by robed members of the Ku Klux Klan in downtown Atlanta. That was very scary. The only thing about Georgia at the time is they weren't allowed to have their faces covered. But seeing and hearing all that hate, being singled out as an outside agitator, I really knew I wanted to participate more. And that's why I started going out on the sit-in demonstrations. I knew that I was part of a great social movement beyond myself, and I wanted to be useful. And so, being white, I could go up to one of these lunch counters. They were called Crystals, like McDonald's today. And when I get to the door, they would unlock it to let me in because I was white. I would drop my purse, and then all the Black students would come piling in behind me and grab seats at the lunch counter. So I felt like I had a good role. But we were being charged with disorderly conduct, and the police and the business owners were frustrated by that and insisted that we be charged for trespassing, which were laws that were passed throughout the South specifically to punish sit-in demonstrators. And that's how come I got such a serious sentence. One thing Karen said I wanted to correct is that when the judge found out that the students at Connecticut College had raised my $15,000 bail, he refused to accept it. He said that because my father was in the military, I was a transient, And the only bail he would accept was unencumbered property in Fulton County, Georgia, $45,000 worth. The reason that I was able to make bail and get out of jail finally after my conviction was that a Black millionaire who owned a chain of chicken restaurants, whom I never met, came forward and posted my bail. While I was in jail, Martin Luther King Sr. came to visit me. He was just furious at what the judge was doing, encumbering, tying up all this property in Atlanta. And so I felt very honored that he came to see me. When I did go to jail, the jails, of course, in Atlanta were segregated. And unfortunately, one time that I went to jail, I was the only white woman that was arrested. And I woke up in the middle of the night. All the other prisoners had surrounded me, the white women, and were hitting me and pulling my hair and threw me on the ground. And it was terrifying. I was 18 years old. But the next morning, the deputy had the women haul me out into the big room, the day room, and lectured the women about how fortunate they were that I was the scum of the earth, and they had dignity and were good people. And I just was curled up in a little ball. I went to court that day, and that's how I got out of the situation. But when my trial was announced, I had already gone back to Connecticut College, where my friends in Plant House were so caring and supportive in helping me make the transition back. All of a sudden, my case got called out of 100 sit-in demonstrators that had been charged for trespassing in Atlanta. And I had to fly to Atlanta. When I got there, the judge discovered that my original bail had been posted by a doctor from Spelman, the campus doctor, who'd been arrested at an adult demonstration at a cocktail lounge. And he immediately negated the bail and had me put in jail again. When I went back, and this is maybe a few months after I'd been in this white segregated jail before, one of the women in it recognized me, and I could see her going around and whispering to all the other prisoners. I really was terrified, but it was so powerful, this feeling that what was going on in this social movement was worth it, that I felt I could risk my life for what I believed in. And that's what happened to me.
And so you're talking about the physical dangers which you faced in jail and in the South. I've had the great privilege of looking through. So Marty's story made headlines in Time Magazine, New York Times, overseas, in France and Germany. And so you received so many letters, both hate mail, which were vicious.
Terrible,
and you
terrible hate mail.
Like, yes, truly astonished, just unspeakable. I mean, it was a violence in of itself, but you also, so I would like to know, you're 18, 19 years old during this time period. How did, and your parents, your family also received both support mail as well as hate mail. How did you support, like, how did you find support or courage to just navigate, both the burdens on your, family and you, as well as, just this amount of attention and, the stress of the situation?
Well, I want to point out that the reason there was so much publicity around my case was because I was an 18-year-old white girl from the North. And that's why it became such a big story. At the same time, there were Black students throughout these historically Black colleges in the South, thousands participating in sit-in demonstrations, getting convicted, going to jail, and very little media attention being given to this spontaneous outpouring of direct action that was occurring in the South. And yet my case got all this attention, and there was obviously media bias that's how it got the attention. You know, you can pass laws and win court cases, but real social change requires mass direct action. And I knew that was true. And I really believed in what SNCC was doing, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And once I got back to Connecticut, I really spent my time raising money for SNCC. But knowing that a lot of legal resources from the NAACP Legal Defense Fund was being spent on the appeals in my case. Like the Voting Rights Act that Peter talked about, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was the basis for the Supreme Court saying retroactively that since it was no longer against the law to seek public accommodations, that young people shouldn't be serving these sentences, and people whose cases were still in the court system all had their cases dropped. One thing I'd like to point out, the judge was so furious that the Supreme Court had reversed the conviction in my case that he actually had me re-indicted for riot and malicious mischief for a demonstration that I had been to, that I wasn't even one of the sit-in participants. I was out in the street as part of a mass protest. So, you know, my case from a legal point of view just kept going on and on, although eventually we won in the Fifth Circuit on that second charge. One thing I want to point out, the sit-in movement of the 60s was a singing movement. And it was the songs that gave people so much strength and courage. And there would be singing before you went on a demonstration, and there would be singing in the jails, and there was singing afterwards. Oh, freedom, we shall not be moved, ain't gonna let segregation turn me around. And we shall overcome always, with the verse, we are not afraid. And yet there was so much to be afraid of. I noticed with the Black Lives Matters today, which is another great social movement, it's a chanting movement instead of a singing movement. And so you hear hands up, don't shoot, and all kinds of other chants as young people pour into the streets. Once again, so much like the sit-in movement of the 60s, using direct action to demand change.
Marty, I'm going to take you back in the time machine. I'm going to quote, there's a quote in the New York Times in December 16th, so one day after your Supreme Court announcement in 1964. After all this, like a whole year of trials and just hard work and you know, attention drawn to, of course, the movement, as well as your participation in it, you changed people's lives. So many people wrote to you about how you inspired them, you helped them be able to talk about race, and even talk to their parents about race. So I just want to take a moment to give a quote, to share a quote. You said, "I saw what segregation was doing to my teachers and friends. I felt it was my obligation to do something. That's why I went downtown to sit in, because I felt it was something I could do." So I'd like to ask you, what did this remarkable Mardon Walker, in my words, do afterwards? How did the civil rights movement impact your life, and what did you go on to do?
Well, I did go back to Connecticut College, but after my junior year, I left to work at an anti-poverty program in a housing project in New Haven, Connecticut. I did finish, though, at Connecticut College. I went on and got a law degree, became a civil rights lawyer. I represented women, prisoners, gay men and lesbians, and the Black Panther Party in Maryland. But, you know, I didn't like losing when I knew I was on the side of justice. And I found it very frustrating to practice civil rights law. And so I changed careers like Willie did. And I wanted to really change the lives of students at an inner city community college in Baltimore. And I felt like I did that I made a difference every day. I also helped the staff get a union contract with AFSCME, and I stayed at the community college as an educator until I retired.
Thank you. I think we could spend all day talking to all of you. Your stories are so fascinating. And I think our audience also has questions and comments for all of you. I would just like to thank all of Marty, Willie, Mary, and Pete for sharing your stories and time with us. And maybe we could move on to the Q&A from the audience.
Yes, thank you to everyone. That was so inspiring and enlightening, and we do have some comments and questions. I'm going to start with actually, Karen, I think this might be for you. Susan has asked, has Mary and Willie's complete account of their life and experiences, as well as Peter and Marty, are these written down? And I know that you interviewed everyone for many hours. Can you tell us a little bit about where these stories will live?
Come to the CHS and visit the exhibit. We have more of their story in the exhibit, as well as items from activists who are not here with us tonight. Marty also shared many really wonderful items from her time in the civil rights movement as well. So I actually would turn these questions over to Mary and Peter, Marty, and Willie to see if you might also be interested in recording your life stories for us.
Does anyone want to, are these stories that you tell family and pass these on? Mary or Willie, you can start with you and then we'll kind of go through.
Well, personally for me, I have done quite a few oral histories, especially with one of the members of the board of the Connecticut Historical Society, Fiona Vernell. Yeah. And she has interviewed me, and of course, she has had exhibits other than what is now being shown at the Connecticut Historical Society. So I have had maybe 1, 2, 3, at least 6 half dozen of oral histories in regarding family members as well too, who the most recently, we just had a 91-year-old great uncle of mine give his story as to how things were during the Great Migration when he came to Connecticut.
Amazing. Excellent. And I see that Karen put some information about those interviews that you have done, oral histories, in the chat. Mary?
Yes.
Mary, did you want to add anything?
No, I haven't written about that time. I've talked about it, but other than talking about it informally with friends, no, it hasn't been recorded. But others have. There are a lot of books about experiencing that time in Mississippi and in the South.
I am very fortunate to have Connecticut College invite me back for a wonderful program a few years ago with civil rights hero of mine, Zahara Simmons, who was in my dorm at Spelman. And when I went to Connecticut College for my 50th reunion, the library had mounted a display of some of my letters and the story of what had happened to me. So I feel like Connecticut College has preserved that. But like Mary, I want to point out that there is a wonderful book. It's called Hands on the Freedom Plow, and it's personal accounts by women in SNCC. And if somebody wants to really dive into being there and what it was like, Hands on the Freedom Plow is the book to read.
Thank you. Peter, have you in any way documented your experiences?
Yes, I have. And when I was working in Alabama for SNCC, there was a SNCC organizer, field secretary named Cortland Cox. And I remember him saying that he hoped to live long enough to define his life. And so about 20 years ago, I started writing down my freedom movement memories. And for anybody interested, there's a great website called Veterans of the Civil Rights Movement. And a lot of people that have been in the movement have signed up and are on that website. And my reflections are there. If you look me up on that site, you can read, what I had to say and what many other people had to say. I also wanted to say one thing about what Marty said, and that is that I just wanted to support what she said about music. I think it's one of the missing links of the civil rights movement when the story is told of just how significant music was to that movement. And I think if you've seen the movie Selma, that was a pretty good movie, except it left out all the music, it left out the singing. And I think the most important aspect of it was the music of the civil rights movement. The singing was not entertainment. We sang. We weren't entertaining. It was our life that was coming out and our, aspirations that are coming out and a way to deal with our fear. And it was every day. I mean, it was always there. It was spontaneous and it was not spontaneous, but I just can't express how important music is to a movement. And so I wanted to thank Marty for bringing it up because I didn't get a chance.
Well, Peter, there is actually a question in the chat about how did you help the Blacks in the South overcome their fear? You knew you were leaving, but was there anything that you did in particular to help them overcome fear?
Yeah, I mean, I think it was just constantly talking to the same people again and again, visiting them, getting to know them, establishing trust, bringing people together in small groups to try to talk about their fear. There were houses that I went to, and I would guess I went 50 times. I was 20 years ago training a young labor organizer, and I had this whole routine of we were talking single payer here, and all we had to end with organized labor in Maine. That wasn't a problem getting to talk to people. So we had to keep going back, and after 4 or 5 times, this young Annie Morris said to me, like, how often do we have to do this? And I said, we have to do it until it's done.
Right.
And I mean, I think that's the nature of the struggle. And at some point, it takes a life of its own. You don't need organizers. Enough people have done it, but it's here. That's what the struggle is.
Right. Now, Peter, I have another question for you. I don't think we addressed what did you do after, because as the impact of your participation in the 60s, but I know that you moved on to the labor movement. So could you speak a little bit about, were there any parallels between the civil rights movement and the labor movement?
I mean, I think it was the next step. If you call the slogan or the call for the March on Washington in 1963 was for jobs and justice. And I think what the civil rights movement accomplished was on the justice side, but not on the jobs side. And that's where the labor movement became important. And I think it goes back, I mean, it's like, the same mistakes are often made. Saul Alinsky, a famous organizer, once said, a movement should always take its time in defining its goals, because very often you'll achieve them and find out it wasn't what you were really after. And I think that after the Civil War, what people wanted was 40 acres and a mule. It was the jobs question. It was economic security that was number one, but they didn't get that. And I think that's also what happened in the 60s, is that we were able to win civil rights and voting rights, but the right to a job, the ability to earn a living, which is probably even more primary, never got to be, it was addressed at the end. I mean, that's what Martin Luther King was doing when he died with the Poor People's Campaign. But that wasn't achieved, and it still hasn't been achieved. It's still our major problem, I think. And I think that's what drew me to the labor movement. I mean, the other thing was, I'm not a rich person, and so I always have, and I found myself in the 1970s, working in a rubber mill. And of course, we had to organize a union to protect ourselves. And that's really how I got involved. It's been said of me that I brought to the labor movement what I learned in the civil rights movement, what the civil rights movement learned from the labor movement. And if you study the civil rights movement, you'll understand, I think, what I'm saying, because it was through the Highlander Folk School that really trained a lot of the early civil rights organizers. And that was the same group in the 1920s and 30s that trained the CIO organizers. And so there's a connection between mass movements, and they go on back for centuries, actually.
Right, many are connected. Thank you.
Yeah.
Well, I think that we are just about out of time. If anyone has any other questions, please throw them in the chat. And while we're waiting to see if any last minute questions, I do want to say that, reiterate again, my thank you to our speakers tonight. It is truly an honor that you were willing to share your stories with us. And if you wanted to learn more about these stories and others, the Connecticut Freedom Workers Remembering the Civil Rights Movement is our exhibit that is on display until October. And we also have the Freedom Journey 1965 photographs of the Selma to Montgomery March by Stephen Summerstein. That is a New York Historical Society traveling exhibition that we have right now as well. And that will be up until August 28th. So we do have a guided tours we're offering starting June 1st. They are free with the price of admission, and they are Tuesdays, Fridays, and Saturdays if you wanted to learn a little bit more about these with an educator. And we also have a 3D tour. If you're not able to come visit us, we have a 3D tour of the Connecticut Freedom Workers. So I just put both of those links in the chat. So please come visit us or check us out on our 3D tour. And we have a lot of great thank yous in the chat. Susan is saying is really taking her back to such a critical part of her life. And Joanne is mentioning thank you, and Casey as well. Thank you for adding to Justice in America and for all the work that you've done over these years. And so I, of course, would like to thank you as well for, again, for all the work that you do, and again, for sharing your stories with us.
Thank you.
And I think that's it. I don't see any other questions in the chat. And so I'm going to say good night to all of our guests. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Lots of thank yous in the chat.
I liked the way there were a lot of connections between the four of us
Oh, yes.
as we told our stories.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, everyone is so interesting and articulate.
You guys had, I just want to say that I consider myself the beneficiaries of your efforts and what you guys did in the southern states. And of course, the beneficiaries were those who actually did the migration and talked about those struggles. That's what I was hearing for the most part. So thank
There
you.
were sure heroes like Fannie Lou Hamer that
Yeah.
that came out of the movement that even today inspire people to keeping on.
Mm-hmm. Oh, yes. I'm never going to stop.
I find it's almost embarrassing when people thank me, because I always feel like I'm the one that is thankful just to be able to experience it. And what I learned is just, amazing. I mean, it just set the tone of my whole life. And so when someone said, I can appreciate people saying thank you in retrospect, but it's really the other way around. I mean, I just felt so honored to be part of it and be allowed into people's lives and to participate. And, like I said, it set the tone of my life. So when somebody says thank you, it's embarrassing to me. Again, I appreciate it. I'm trying, but yeah, I don't feel I should be thanked, I guess. That thanks is in the doing, I guess, and I'll leave it at that.
It really did set the tone for each of our lives. And you think of all the thousands of people that participate in the civil rights movement, and you just think all of those people went on to do wonderful things for this country in
Yes.
little ways, not necessarily big ways. I mean, John Lewis was a giant, but there must be so many students who experienced the sit-in movement and became different people than they otherwise would have.
Yeah.
I don't know if you all saw that comment from Casey Russo. She says, thank you, you inspire me. She says, as a younger activist, you
Yeah,
inspire me. So you're role models for a whole new generation.
absolutely.
Well,
Fantastic.
to see this new generation of young people and Black Lives Matter, and finally, there's this massive social movement of young people spontaneously taking direct action, and it just warms your heart to see it happening again.
Yes.
And also that white people are welcomed as allies. I think that's a good word.
Yep.
Yes.
Yes.
Even I remember reading a story where a little all-white town in Maine had a Black Lives Matters march. And I thought it really has spread everywhere.
Yes. It's a great movement of our times.